Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Ballmer from the University of Florida. Ordinarily, I would be attending the National Autism Conference as I do every year, and I'm sure many of you do as well. Of course, I wish we were all together. As one of my favorite parts of the conference is when we are able to interact during the presentations, share comments, experiences, and so on. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do that today. What I have tried to do is include some information that relates to common questions I receive uh, related to my work in behavioral treatment and some of the impediments that we are experiencing. The topic for this talk really came about over the last couple of years in visiting a couple of facilities and in my own work with severe behavior in the state of Florida, and also actually last year at the end of my presentation at this conference, I put up a single slide near the end that was called Impediments to Effective Behavioral Treatment. And I found that we as a group stayed on that general topic for, I believe it was over a half hour. So I said to myself, I'm going to flesh that out a little bit and revisit that part of our discussion for this year's conference. So, what I hope to do today is um, first, I'm going to kind of set the stage by describing what I mean by impediments to effective behavioral treatment. Sometimes it feels as if those of us in applied behavior analysis are saying that we have the answer, we know how to treat all forms of very severe behavior disorders. The fact of the matter is, we don't. The ones that sort of rise up onto our radar screen get to that point because there is some impediment to making the treatment effective. In the second half of the presentation, what I hope to do is just very briefly overview some new directions that my group and some other groups are taking to try to get at these impediments and make our behavioral treatments better and more wide ranging in the sense that they would be effective for more people. So, to that end, what I will do in this presentation is break it up into two parts so that you can feel free to take a break after the first section. The first section will be where I go over the impediments to effective behavioral treatments. And the second part, when we resume, will be a description of some new directions and potential solutions. Now, I want to be clear that the impediments that I will describe is not an exhaustive list. It's just a list of impediments that I and close colleagues have encountered in recent years. And certainly the list of potential solutions is not at all exhaustive. In fact, what I'm hoping to do is to get you thinking about methods that you could use to uh, resolve some of these impediments, or at least come close to doing so. So we'll spend about an hour and 10, hour and 15 minutes on this first section, and then we'll take a break. I want to acknowledge several collaborators to the projects that I'll be describing herein. You'll see that this is not a single research study. There are numerous studies that I'll touch on. Um, Ferris Cronfley is now at Rutgers University. He was a recent PhD graduate of mine. He's been doing a lot of work in parent training, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, as is Lindsay Loveros, my current doctoral student at the University of Florida. Megan Deshay is now at Caldwell. She had been doing some clinical work with us and the beginning of a research project related to using positive reinforcement to treat escape behavior. And also, she's been assisting us in a longitudinal study that I'll be very briefly describing in the second half today. Carrie Peters is my close colleague at the University of Florida. She's in the Department of Psychiatry, and she's been instrumental in just about all of the studies I'll describe. And then Sarah Slocum, who is now at the Marcus Center in Atlanta, was my former doctoral student, and she played a key role in some of our research using positive reinforcement as treatment for escape behavior. I think I know many of you. As I said, I attend the conference every year, and I see many familiar faces from year to year. But for any of you who I have not met, I wanted to give a little bit of background to sort of let you know how I got to this point in my research in terms of trying to understand and resolve some of the impediments to the treatment of severe behavior. I started out as a graduate student at the University of Florida in 1992, and my advisor was Brian Iwata. Uh, Brian was a still is a prominent researcher in the area of self-injurious behavior. And so when I joined his lab as a graduate student in 1992, that was the focus of our work. We were working with adults with severe uh, behavior disorders, primarily self-injury. From 1992 to 1996, or excuse me, with Brian, I worked from 1987 to 1992. From 1992 to 1996, I had my first faculty position in the school psychology program at Louisiana State University. And it was here that I translated some of the work I had done with adults, but to children in school settings. And I first started to encounter some of the impediments we'll be discussing today. For example, doing a functional analysis in a school where a child might get hurt and there's no medical personnel. That can be a true impediment. In 1996 to 1998, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I was an associate professor in the medical school. Here, I worked at the Children's Seashore House, where we saw children with very severe behavior, including self-injury and aggression. And I learned a lot more about many of the medical outcomes of behavior and medical impediments to behavioral treatment at that time. In 1998, I returned to the University of Florida, and I'm currently a professor and associate chair in the psychology department at the university. I'm the director of the Behavior Analysis Research Clinic, and I'm associated with the newly established University of Florida Health Center for Autism and Neurodevelopment. We had just cut the ribbon on our new center about a month or maybe a couple of weeks before we had to shut down due to COVID. So we're anxiously awaiting our return to work at that center. In terms of an overview of today's discussion, I'm going to touch on first the primary advantages of understanding the function of behavior. I realize that this component of the talk is probably a review for many of you, especially those of you who are board certified behavior analysts. But I think the view of this has been changing in recent years. And I'd like to kind of reiterate or reestablish what are some of the advantages of understanding the operant function of behavior. Without understanding the operant functions of behavior, we really couldn't be having the discussion that we're having today. We couldn't have many of the effective treatments that we have. So I want to kind of revisit that just to make sure we're kind of on the same playing field throughout the rest of the discussion. Then I'd like to move into a discussion of situations that impede the normal course of behavioral treatment. Many of us in the field, many of you in the audience have had wonderful successes treating what appears to be the most severe behavior you could imagine. You can all think of cases where you've had individuals who were aggressive and you implemented a behavioral intervention and greatly reduced that behavior, or self-injury, or property destruction. Um, but on some occasions, you are unable, for whatever reason, to proceed with the normal course of treatment. Something gets in the way. And those are the variables I want to focus upon today. First, identifying what they are, and then coming up with some solutions. Now, I will say that some of these impediments and solutions I have talked about in prior presentations at this very conference. So I won't necessarily go into as much depth or detail about some of them. For example, one of the impediments is when extinction is not an option for various reasons. I talked about that for 2.5 or 3 hours a couple of years ago. Today, I'll condense that part of the discussion to probably about 15 minutes. So there may be some redundancies for some of you, but I think that in the interest of complete coverage of these impediments, we need to touch on all of the topics, or as many as we can, not all. And then in the second half of today's talk, as I mentioned, I'll go into proposed directions for solutions, future research, and application. We don't have all the answers. We don't have all the solutions. In fact, we have very few solutions. But I want to talk about those solutions we do have. I want to talk about how these impediments have guided our future research, and then some considerations that we all might take into account for our own application of behavioral principles and behavioral interventions. Many of you have heard me speak at this conference and other locations, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on this other than to say that I sometimes use the term behavior disorders, sometimes I say problem behavior. Generally, what I'm referring to under these circumstances would be these forms of severe behavior. Self-injury, this can take the form of self-hitting, head banging, self-scratching, eye poking, various forms, just about anything that you can think of that would cause harm to oneself. We've seen that happen before. Aggression refers to behavior that may cause harm to others in the environment. Property destruction can refer to breaking items, computers, plates, dishes, windows, but even something much more uh, simple like tearing up a book or tearing up uh, calendars off the wall, things like that. Um, Screaming and flopping can sometimes be problematic. If a parent has to take a child to the grocery store or to a restaurant, this could be a very serious issue because people around the parent do not necessarily understand what is happening when the child is screaming and flopping, and the parent may not be able to employ their usual strategies that they would follow under these circumstances. And so a lot of times this keeps parents and families from going out to movies or going to the store, going to restaurants, other normal family activities. We don't focus a lot on stereotypic behavior, especially if it's not interfering with the individual's learning. Uh, However, we do at times encounter what might be considered severe stereotypic behavior, or sometimes even severe rigid behavior, where, for example, an individual will only follow a set schedule, and if there are any deviations from it, then some of these other forms of severe problem behavior occur. Or other times, the individual will only display repetitive behavior and it gets in the way of, let's say, learning new skills or learning self-care activities. And then a final example is classroom disruptive behavior, where the behavior might not in itself be dangerous, but it may be preventing others in the environment from learning as readily as they might otherwise have done. These are just a few examples. There's other examples I'll touch on, like pica. eating of inedible objects, and others that I'll point out along the way. So I mentioned that I wanted to kind of revisit some of the advantages of understanding the operant function of behavior. The first is that when we get a good handle on understanding the operant function of behavior, it improves our scientific understanding of why aberrant behavior occurs. It's interesting to me that as I get older and become a more senior member of this field, I find that there are fewer and fewer people who actually remember the way that behavior like self injury was treated or the way it was evaluated in the 1970s, for example, or early 1980s. There wasn't so much a focus on trying to understand why the behavior was occurring. There was more of a focus on understanding um, how to change it. And sometimes that limited the treatments because they might be a good short-term fix, but usually were not a good long-term fix. So when studies like the Iwata et al. Functional analysis study first came out in the early 1980s, this was a major scientific advance because it allowed us to now say we understand some of the variables that are actually turning on and turning off the behavior. It was an experimental analysis of behavior. So, from a scientific standpoint, it's important that we have a thoroughgoing understanding of the function of behavior. This is one that often uh, kind of slips past casual observation because a lot of people think of a functional analysis or understanding the function of behavior strictly for clinical purposes. Well, there's another scientific purpose to understanding the function of operant behavior, and that is that um, doing so can appropriately categorize individuals for research participation. So, if you look at a lot of the research literature, say in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, as one of our leading journals, you'll find that the first part of the study is often a functional analysis, and it's done to show that, in fact, the participants in the study had behavior displayed by, let's say, negative, or maintained by, I should say, negative reinforcement, because the study is about treatment for behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. Or they might first demonstrate that the behavior is reinforced by attention because the study is about treatment of behavior maintained by positive reinforcement. Similarly, the experimenters might screen for behavior that is not socially reinforced or that is automatically reinforced, in which case those individuals could enter into a study on treatment of automatically reinforced behavior. So this approach is a nice screening method to not only convince the researchers, but to convince their audience that the proper participants were involved in the study. And that's an important point from a scientific standpoint. So we can't really eliminate the functional analysis approach because of that niche that it has. Another important reason for understanding the operant function of behavior is it improves our ability to translate basic principles to application. So prior to understanding what was reinforcing the problem behavior, or that the reinforcer or reinforcers were for problem behavior, it would have been impossible to actually translate what we had learned from basic research. And a good example of this is the matching law, and I'll touch on this briefly later on today. But if you are going to apply the principles of the matching law to the treatment of severe behavior, you have to know the reinforcer or reinforcers maintaining that behavior, because you're going to manipulate the reinforcement rate. You're going to manipulate the quality of reinforcement, the duration of reinforcement. And the more that you can skew uh, reinforcement in favor of some appropriate alternative behavior, the less you will see the problem behavior. But a thorough understanding of how something like the matching law translates to application is only made possible by understanding the operant functions of behavior. And finally, of course, it is important to understand the operant function of behavior because it improves our clinical intervention. We can implement treatments that have all kinds of components based on an understanding of the operant function. So, in some cases, we can cut off the source of reinforcement. If we didn't know what the source of reinforcement was, we couldn't cut it off. So, it makes extinction a viable component. Differential reinforcement. If someone is engaging in severe problem behavior because it produces attention, we can now teach them alternative ways to get attention while minimizing reinforcement for the problem behavior. And we can even alter establishing operations. So, for example, if we know that someone is engaging in problem behavior to get food, then we might change their snack schedule or alter the motivating operations such that there is a reduced need, if you will, to engage in the problem behavior to access food. So there are all kinds of advantages to understanding the operant function of behavior. I could go on about this. In fact, I have many times just talking exclusively about this topic. Very recently, prior to the COVID shutdown, I was in Finland, and we talked about uh, these four features of the functional analysis for most of an entire morning. But I have a feeling with this audience, we're kind of on the same page here, but I just wanted to reiterate these points because they will thread throughout the discussion today. Oh, I forgot I added this bullet as well. Um, Understanding the operant functions of behavior improves our ability to evaluate treatment integrity. So, what I mean by this is to evaluate whether someone is implementing a treatment correctly, we need to know what correct is. So, we need to know if they're withholding the right reinforcer during extinction or differential reinforcement. Are they delivering the correct reinforcer and at the correct time? Without knowing what the reinforcers are, we cannot correctly judge their implementation of treatment integrity. We'll come back to that point later today as well. So I think most of you are probably familiar with the typical course of behavioral treatment. Many of us do this on a day to day basis. We typically conduct some type of functional assessment. This may include a functional analysis when possible. The functional assessment is designed to get at the question, why is this behavior occurring? What are the reinforcers for this behavior? What are the typical antecedent contexts that are associated with the occurrence of this behavior? If we complete a good functional assessment, we get at that question about operant function that we just went over on the prior slide, and then we can develop reinforcement for some alternative or replacement behavior. So we can reinforce that behavior of asking for attention in some way that is not harmful. We can place the problem behavior on extinction or at least minimize reinforcement for the problem behavior. And then when we, as a professional behavior analyst or other professional, develop an effective treatment, we have methods that we follow to train care providers. So we might train teachers, we might train other therapists, we might train other behavior analysts, we might train parents, siblings, grandparents, child care workers, various people to implement those treatments by using a behavioral skills training approach. So this is very commonly what we do, and I don't have specific percentages, but I can say that this approach is generally very effective. It is probably the most effective approach to treatment of behavior disorders that there is in existence. We follow it almost uniformly with all of our cases. So we typically see something like this in our treatments. This is from a study by Ferris Cronfley that we are currently writing up for publication. There's nothing surprising here. We have a baseline responses per minute of problem behavior, which is the dark circles in the data path under BL for baseline. Then we went to differential reinforcement of alternative behavior or functional communication training in this case, where we reinforced a command to obtain attention or preferred toys. We saw that the command replaced the problem behavior. Then we returned to baseline to make sure it was our treatment that had the effect, and then we went back to the DRA treatment and found that the problem behavior decreased markedly and the command was maintained at relatively high levels. So this is pretty standard. This is how we use information about the functional behavior to develop a treatment. Nothing new here. This is standard. In 2001, one of my former graduate students, Bethany Marcus, published a study on parent training where we showed that if the treatments that we had developed in our work at schools could be translated to home through parent training, we would see very similar effects when the parents were implementing the treatment. At the time, we didn't call this behavioral skills training. That term kind of uh, evolved, if you will, in more recent years. But essentially, that is what we did. First, we identified an effective treatment in a highly controlled circumstance. Then we walked through the treatment with the parents to make sure they understood it, understood the logic of it. Then we did role play, where first the parent served as the child. Then we did another role play where the therapist served as the child. Commonly now we will use video as a part of the parent training to kind of demonstrate the procedures to them. We did not in this study that took place a couple of decades ago. Um, then we provide the parents with immediate feedback as they're working with their child. Sometimes this is just out loud, sometimes it's through a Bluetooth type bug in the ear. Um, then when they get skilled at implementing the procedures, we delay the feedback. Then we move to monitoring and follow up, and then do booster training as necessary. Just kind of standard behavioral skills training. The effects that we saw in that study and the effects that we typically see to this day look something like this. In the baseline, we take a look at the parent's correct response to the inappropriate behavior and their correct response to the appropriate behavior. And this is fairly common where we see sort of variable responding by the parent. Sometimes they do it correctly, other times they do not. And as a result, the child's behavior is mixed. Some problem behavior, some appropriate behavior in this case, compliance to instructional activity and tantrums. Once we trained the parent using that behavioral skills training approach, she was close to 100% in her implementation. And you can see that that had a very pronounced effect on her child's behavior, with an increase in compliance, a decrease in tantrums, and this was sustained at 1 month follow-up. Again, I'm not showing you this because it's something new. I'm showing you this as a demonstration of sort of the standard course of behavioral intervention. At least this is what we have adopted in my group. So we progress from the functional assessment to the treatment, to the parent training, and then to the observation in the relevant situation. I say parent training, but it could be teacher training, sibling training, other care provider training, whatever. So this is all very well and good. However, and here's where we get to the central point of today's discussion. There are numerous impediments that sometimes get in the way of everything that I just showed you. One is when extinction cannot be implemented. So if we can't cut off the source of reinforcement, differential reinforcement becomes less effective and much more challenging to implement. So I'll talk about those challenges and then later talk about some solutions. There are difficulties with prevention science using standard applied behavior analysis methods. So ideally, we would want to take any child with intellectual disabilities or autism and put into place procedures that we believe would prevent the development of severe problem behavior, such as automatically reinforced self injury, for example. However, the methods of our field have not been firmly established to do that type of work. I'll touch on how that is a problem and some potential solutions for that today as well. I mentioned automatic reinforcement. Well, in the case that I just showed you, the child's behavior was clearly sensitive to tangible reinforcers, parent attention as a reinforcer. And when that happens, treatment is relatively easy because we can withhold those reinforcers and present them contingent on appropriate behavior. But when the behavior produces its own source of reinforcement, it is much more difficult to identify what the reinforcer is and how we would withhold that reinforce and how we would present that reinforcer contingent on some alternative behavior. Another impediment is behavior that requires medical evaluation. And I will talk about this from um, sort of a three-prong approach. One is that sometimes medical variables contribute to the occurrence of the problem behavior. Sometimes medical variables influence the occurrence of problem behavior. Sometimes the behavior requires medical attention. And all three of those can be an impediment to an applied behavior analyst implementing an intervention procedure. I'm also going to talk about behavior that occurs for reasons that are not yet well understood. There's a very strong line of basic research on elicited aggression, elicited self-biting, biting that occurs in the context of aversive stimulation or reinforcer loss. That literature has not been well incorporated into applied behavior analysis. And I'm going to make a case that it should be because we might not be fully addressing the function of the behavior if we ignore these possibilities. And I'll talk about some examples. And then, of course, another impediment is one many of us have experienced more recently, and that is with service disruptions. We may have a very wonderful treatment going, everything's moving along very nicely, but then something like this happens, a COVID crisis, or even something much briefer, like if you're working in schools and maybe there's a 2-week vacation around the winter holidays, that might disrupt services. So what do we do? What do we recommend to families in those times, especially because families are overwhelmed for a number of reasons when they are home with their child who may have intellectual disabilities or autism. So I'm going to talk about some of those impediments and some possible solutions as well today. So I'm going to go one by one through these and discuss these impediments before we take a break and then move to the solutions after the break. So let's look at when extinction cannot be implemented. Those of you who have known me for the past several years know that this is a topic that my group has really been focused on and developing. Um, we have found that there are numerous situations when extinction either cannot be implemented or it is not viable. One is a physical context, when the individual is larger or faster than the parent, therapist, or teacher. So we have worked with individuals who are 6'5", 230 pounds, and it might not be possible for us as a therapist to actually physically guide someone through an instructional activity. We might not be strong enough. They might be faster than us. So if they're eloping, they can get away from us, and there's nothing that we can do about it in terms of catching them because we're not fast enough. We've had children as young as 3 or 4 who are quicker than us, who can get under a table and escape instructional activity just by being slippery and smaller than us. And it would be very difficult to immediately physically guide them through an instructional activity. So just physical features make extinction difficult, if not impossible, at times. There may be legal reasons why extinction cannot be put in place. So suppose that your functional assessment shows that physical contact is a reinforcer for severe self-injurious behavior. However, it might be that state, local, school, or facility laws require that you block the dangerous behavior even when you know it's attention maintained. This might be for very good reason because the person could do very serious injury. So you might be blocking the behavior even though you know that physical contact is reinforcing the behavior. So you have to be able to develop interventions that can outweigh the fact that the behavior is still reinforced. And that can be very challenging. That is an impediment to effective behavioral treatments. Similarly, there are ethical limitations. So you cannot include a component of an intervention that places individuals at risk for getting hurt. So even if it's not a law or a rule, you have to use your professional judgment and say that somebody might get hurt. Um, I have spent the greater part of the last 5 years really trying to stress that putting the word ignore in a behavior plan or teaching care providers to ignore behavior is really a fallacy. It's not something that we should put in there. In fact, it's dangerous. There have been legal situations surrounding the use of the word ignore, especially when somebody displays aggression, for example, and somebody else gets hurt. And it was written into the behavior plan to ignore the behavior, or maybe the person hurts themselves. We shouldn't really be saying ignore, maybe minimize attention, ensure the safety of others in the environment. But in short, it's an ethical consideration about including a strict extinction component into the procedure when that may not be viable from an ethical standpoint. There are practical reasons. I talked about treatment integrity a short time ago. Well, it is actually the case that the most highly trained therapists make errors. So sometimes I personally will demonstrate procedures to a parent or to my graduate students or undergraduate students, and I make mistakes when I do it. And I've been doing this for well over 30 years now. Um, so I make errors. My board certified behavior analyst doctoral students and postdocs make errors when they're implementing procedures. So if we as highly trained professionals make errors, what about parents? Wouldn't we expect them to make errors? What about grandparents, teachers, paraprofessionals, staff, siblings, family, friends? All of these people are interacting with our client in some way. And when they make errors, what they are essentially doing some of the time is reinforcing the problem behavior. So, in other words, extinction isn't in place. So, that's an impediment to our treatment. We have to figure out treatments that are likely to be effective when those uh, when those impediments are there, when people continue to reinforce the problem behavior. I alluded to medical contexts. Um, if you're working in a school and you observe a behavior that might immediately produce injury to self or others, you probably can't continue with your assessment, let alone a treatment that involves extinction, because any single instance of the behavior might require medical or advice or collaboration. So if you notice that a lot of the treatments that are described in journals related to the treatment of self-injurious behavior take place in medical or at least collaborative medical settings where the individual can be safe. But it's an impediment to translating our work to home and schools because it is outside the scope of our practice to assume that we know precisely the degree of the injury that will be caused by the behavior that the individual is engaging in. So we have to be very careful, and often that means that we cannot implement a strict extinction component. And then, let's face it, our technology is not perfect at this stage of the game. We may not know yet the specific source of reinforcement for some automatically reinforced behavior. Or even if we do, we can't stop it. So we might assume or find out that for a particular individual, let's say that with rumination, the regurgitation and reswallowing of food, that the taste of the food itself or the reswallowing of the food is reinforcing. Well, we don't have the technology yet to cut that off. So we would have to have treatments that would be effective in the face of the continued automatic reinforcement of the behavior. And that's very, very challenging. So when we can't implement extinction, it poses a significant challenge to our treatments. So at this point, I'm not describing the solutions, recall. I'm just pointing out where these impediments are. And again, I won't always have solutions to all of these, but I'm opening up a discussion for understanding that our standard behavioral approach is not always going to be effective. There's a lot more work to be done clinically and through research in our field to understand these processes and these impediments. So the second one is difficulties with prevention science using standard applied behavior analysis methods. So when a scientist is interested in looking at something like, let's say, the prevention of cancer, there are methodologies that exist for that research, such as using survival curve methodology to see if we can prolong individuals' lives without diagnosis of cancer and so on. But in applied behavior analysis, we use reversal designs, multiple baseline designs, in short, designs that are arranged to specifically evaluate substantial behavior change. Well, how do we show that behavior change occurred when the behavior wasn't there to begin with? So, how do we know if we prevent someone from developing self injurious behavior? How do we know if we prevent them from developing escape maintained aggression and so on? So, let's talk about that briefly. We would have to figure out ways to design a study to show that something that was not present has been prevented. So what this is going to require is that in the field of applied behavior analysis, we're going to have to step outside of our typical box of designs. We're going to have to develop new methodologies that will allow us to systematically evaluate whether or not we can develop procedures that would prevent the development of these forms of behavior. Because let's face it, in our field so far, we have set ourselves up such that we wait until the problem behavior is there and then we develop interventions. I'm going to make a case that we should be putting in place effective and healthy contingencies that will prevent the development of the behavior, and we need to design research and clinical applications to show that we have done that. But within this context, I'd like to point out that there are some ethical considerations related to repeated functional analysis of problem behavior. So if we're trying to assess problem behavior on a longitudinal type of basis to see if it's developing or to see if it's going away, we might intermittently reinforce that behavior. Maybe the person has developed alternative skills, but when we set up our functional analysis, the only way to obtain that reinforcer is to engage in problem behavior. So we have to kind of rethink and redesign our functional analysis approach, and I'll be describing that a little bit in the second part today. So another impediment that I mentioned is when behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. A vast majority of the studies that are published on behavioral treatment are treatment studies for behavior that is socially reinforced in one way or another, whether it's through socially mediated escape, negative reinforcement, or socially mediated positive reinforcement in the form of tangibles and or attention. But automatic reinforcement poses its own set of problems. When the behavior produces its own source of reinforcement, it is more difficult to cut off that source of reinforcement. And when reinforcement is automatic, it is more difficult to provide that same type of reinforcement for appropriate alternative behavior because we can't necessarily control that reinforcer. It's produced by the behavior itself. Louis Hagopian has talked about different subtypes of automatically reinforced behavior. If you've not read Hagopian's research in JABA on this topic, I would highly recommend it to you. He has shown that with subtype 1, that behavior is pretty treatable. We can simply usually give individuals contingent access to or non-contingent access to highly preferred items, toys, activities, and so on. And that effectively competes with the occurrence of automatically reinforced problem behavior like self-injury. But subtype 2 is where we run into problems. Subtype 2 is extremely resistant to environmental modifications. So these are the types of functional analyses where you see problem behavior occurring across the board. Even when you give someone lots of toys and preferred activities, they continue to engage in the problem behavior. So a lot of times, at a minimum, some kind of response blocking procedure will have to be incorporated, and sometimes more severe restraining or punishment procedures are introduced. My point here is that clearly automatic reinforcement, especially of this subtype 2, is a very serious impediment to our effective treatment. It doesn't align itself to that straightforward A-B reversal design analysis of differential reinforcement that I showed at the very beginning of the discussion today. The final bullet item on this slide is that um, in my history as the former editor of JABA, an associate editor, I've been a reviewer for numerous behavioral journals. I believe there is a publication bias in relation to uh, assessment and treatment of behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement. And that publication bias works in several ways. One, it's harder to get a very clear treatment for automatically reinforced behavior. So some of that research is not accepted for publication. There's also a self-screening, I believe, that authors engage in where they do not submit their work for publication because they realize it looks messy. It's not a clean type of treatment. And that, again, is one reason why we might see so many studies that are based on treatment of socially reinforced behavior because it's a much easier form of or a much easier function of behavior to treat, I should say. So the file drawer refers to people just putting their data in their file drawer and it stays there and the world doesn't learn about it. I'm not saying this is anyone's fault, but I think that as a field and as individual clinicians and researchers, we need to really start this discussion about treatment failure. When and under what circumstances are we seeing these failures? My hunch is, and from personal experience, we will find that when the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, we're much less likely to develop effective treatments, and therefore I classify automatic reinforcement as one of the prominent impediments to effective behavioral treatment. Is it impossible to treat? No. We have numerous examples of good treatment of behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement, but it is more challenging, and there are probably cases where people have not been treated successfully. So the fourth impediment relates to medical evaluation. So a lot of times as behavior analysts, we're working in home settings, we're working in school settings. We may not have medical colleagues available to us. Yet we read the literature and see that people are doing functional analysis procedures, treatments with extinction, so on and so forth. But is that option always available to us? I think there are several medical impediments. These medical impediments can produce difficulties in relation to the translation of our functional analysis methodologies and our treatment methodologies into homes and schools where there are no medical personnel. There is clearly many times a relationship between medical or physiological variables and behavior. We all know this. If you've worked in the field long enough, you have numerous times either heard or said to yourself or said to someone else, this behavior gets worse when he's sick, or this behavior gets worse when she's tired, or this behavior gets worse when she's in pain. So we know that those variables interact in a causal way with behavior, but often we don't have the collaboration or the colleagues readily available to um, assess those variables and to interpret their potential contribution to the occurrence of problem behavior. Similarly, or relatedly, I should say, many of our clients are on medication. Well, it's widely known that medication changes behavior. It has an effect on behavior in many cases, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But a lot of times, we as behavior analysts do not have control of those medication changes. We're not trained to have control of those medication changes, but it would be nice if we could collaborate with someone or interpret our data in relation to medication changes. But the fact that that's often difficult to do from a home or school setting is an impediment to our the efficacy of our treatments. In addition, sometimes severe behavior requires a medical evaluation. I think I told the story last year at this conference that I was asked within the last few years, several years, to go to a school district uh, to evaluate a young man with severe self-injurious behavior. I saw one instance of his behavior. He went right for the corner of a wall with a severe and forceful headbang that could have hit his eye. And I immediately said, it's not possible to do a functional analysis of this behavior in this context. Now, we were able to put into place emergency treatment procedures, which essentially involved eliminating instructional demands until we could figure out what to do for the next step with him. Uh, but the point being, even I, with many, many years, decades, in fact, experience of doing functional analyses, felt that I could not proceed in that setting because I did not have medical collaboration or advice for behavior that itself might produce immediate injury. And then again, as I said, with behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement, there very likely could be publication and submission biases. So these are the most difficult cases, the most challenging cases when we cannot proceed in a school setting or home setting due to these medical contributors or medical outcomes. So probably we're not getting our clearest treatment effects. uh, Probably people are self-screening um, in terms of submitting articles describing these types of situations. So we need to come up with ways of systematically evaluating these types of contributing variables and to collaborate with other professionals to remain within the scope of our practice. So that's a serious impediment. Another impediment, and this is one that we've been looking into a little bit more deeply in the last couple of years, is that some behavior seems to occur for reasons that are little understood. There is a very strong line of basic behavioral research that looks like it sort of stopped or at least culminated in about 1977. So over 40 years ago. There's a chapter by Hutchinson that is very interesting. It's in a book edited by Honig and Staton called The Handbook of Operant Conditioning. If you ever have a chance to look at that book chapter, it's really interesting. One of the things that Hutchinson shows very clearly is that in situations of reinforcer loss or aversive stimulation, aggression can occur. And it's not aggression that's reinforced by getting the returned access to the reinforcer or by termination of the aversive stimulation. It seems to be elicited by that stimulation, or at least it might be that that type of aversive stimulation or reinforcer loss establishes aggression as a reinforcer. And in particular, Hutchinson describes the phenomenon of biting, including one's self. So it turns out that organisms of all kinds, monkeys, uh, humans, whatever it might be, will bite down in the presence of aversive stimulation. I think many of us working in the field of applied behavior analysis have had clients who will do something like the following. A dump truck goes by outdoors and starts making that noise as it's backing up, like meh, meh, meh. Or maybe an alarm goes off at the school and our client immediately puts the hand to the mouth and bites down. We've had other clients for whom, when we remove their iPad, they immediately bite their hand or they bite your arm when you remove the iPad. This is very similar to that context of reinforcer loss and aversive stimulation. And in our functional assessments, we tend to confound that with a tangible function. For example, like, oh, I give the iPad back, that must be the reinforcer. Well, it could be the mere removal is somehow controlling the behavior as an antecedent in terms of elicitation or related to automatic reinforcement. Similarly, our demand condition is confounded by the fact that um, escape is presented following the problem behavior, but we're also presenting an aversive stimulus in the form of instruction or demand. So some type of aggression or some type of biting might occur merely as a function of the presentation of aversive stimulation. I think that at least this is something we need to explore. We're starting to explore it. I'll talk about the model that we're kind of developing, and make some suggestions for how you might look at this in your clinical assessments. So clearly, when we don't understand all the possible functions of behavior, that's an impediment to our treatment. All of us have said numerous times, like, I've placed this behavior on extinction for the longest time, and he continues to bite his hand. I never give him the iPad back, but he continues to bite his hand. Well, maybe this is one factor we should consider. And then the final impediment that I'll discuss before we take our first break relates to service disruptions. This one is one that I think all of us have recently become acutely aware of, of the circumstances that we have been in for the past several months, where families are shut down, schools are shut down, parents may be without work or they might be working from home and still trying to ensure progress of their child. But without the assistance or with minimal assistance from a professional behavior analyst, our treatments are compromised. This serves as an impediment to our effective behavioral interventions. So I kind of discuss this from a standpoint of themes of the times, the COVID shutdown. But I think that these impediments are relevant to other times, such as holiday vacations, breaks from school, even weekends. But let's talk about it generally in terms of what we're experiencing right now through the COVID times. One theme that uh, I'm faced with on a daily basis in my work, and I'm sure that most of you are as well, is that parents and families are struggling. They're struggling because they're balancing workloads, they're balancing homeschooling, or at least they were until summer break started, and now will be again, probably in many cases, when school starts back up shortly. All of us as parents have household chores. Those things don't stop just because we're balancing workloads and homeschooling. Um, and then there are just the many other things that have happened to families. Um, it might be that you do not have a workload, but that's because you've lost your job or you're temporarily furloughed and you're looking for a job. You have to find a way to pay bills and attend to other siblings. Um, so it is possible. We believe that it is possible for behavior analysts to make evidence-based recommendations during this time of crisis that need not add to stress levels. Unfortunately, what I commonly see is that behavior analysts are doing things like trying to train parents how to be essentially RBTs or how to be BCBAs, and the parents have all these other things going on. Well, there are known effective interventions that do not require extra time. They just require a change of interactional approach. And so that's what I'll be talking about today when I start to present some potential solutions. And there's nothing new there. It's just a different focus on how we might go about having parents maintain some of the intervention effects that we've been able to obtain successfully. But a second theme relates to that, and that is that behavior analysts are struggling because we have to balance our ethical practice with making recommendations that will not add to family stress levels. So we need to continue providing effective service for our clients and for their families. But on the other hand, we have to balance that with the first theme, and that is that parents and families are struggling. So how do we do that? As I mentioned, it it's not always clear that all behavior analysts are fully sensitive to the plights of these families and what they're going through. So I believe that a solution might involve a reorganization or reprioritization of how we go about um, addressing some of these conflicting struggles. Maybe we have procedures that are generally effective that we could be using and recommending to parents and families. So at this point, I'd like to suggest that we take a brief break, maybe 10 to 12 minutes or so. And when we return from the break, I'm going to go back through this list of impediments and talk about strategies that we can use to maybe have an immediate impact on the impediment, maybe immediately resolve some of the impediments, and then also point out some future directions for situations where maybe we don't have the answers yet, but as a field, we could move in that direction. So, thank you for your time in the first part, and I will be rejoining you for part two shortly. Okay, we'll get started again. Here is our list of potential impediments to effective behavioral intervention. I've gone through why each of these could be an impediment, and next I would like to talk about some possible solutions. So we'll start with the impediment about when extinction is not possible. In the past at this conference, I have talked extensively about both differential reinforcement and the matching law. I'm going to return to those topics today because I feel that there is strong evidence that these conceptualizations allow us to get around the potential impediment about extinction. Not completely, but it's a movement in the right direction. I would also like to describe how we have been using positive reinforcement as treatment for escape behavior, even when extinction is not in place. And this has been occurring not only in my own laboratory, in our research and clinical work, but also in several other groups around the country and around the world, actually. Recently, my colleagues and I published this paper on the definition of differential reinforcement. This has come out in early view online this year in 2020, where we have proposed an alternative to the traditional definition of differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. I actually presented this alternative definition at this very conference in the past, but now it is in print, and we've proposed to move forward with this definition from a standpoint of both experimentation and clinical intervention. As many of you know, the prior definition of differential reinforcement of alternative behavior was something along the lines of the following: reinforcement of some alternative response while placing the problem behavior on extinction. Now, I'm not being critical of this definition. After all, along with my mentor, Brian Iwata, I was the one who proposed this definition, and others have used similar definitions, and most present day textbooks use a definition that involves extinction. Our new definition is paraphrased here. providing greater reinforcement at least along at least one dimension for alternative behavior in comparison to reinforcement for problem behavior. So, in other words, even if the problem behavior is still producing reinforcement, meaning that the behavior is not placed on extinction, differential reinforcement can still allow you to, in a sense, stack the deck in favor of the alternative behavior by emphasizing one or more of the dimensions of reinforcement, loading on the reinforcement for the appropriate alternative behavior. So the key distinction between these two definitions, then the old one and the new one, is that the new one does not require extinction for the procedure to be considered differential reinforcement. This notion is based in the principles of the matching law. The matching law posits that in a concurrent arrangement, the relative rate of one response alternative will essentially match the relative rate of reinforcement available for that alternative. That sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It just means that organisms will allocate their responding in a direction that favors that response. So if there's two alternatives, they will respond more on the alternative that produces the greater amount of reinforcement. And the reason it's called matching is because the organisms tend to match the relative allocation. So if there is twice as much reinforcement available for one alternative, twice as much behavior occurs for that alternative. We've done several studies on the matching law in my lab, but most pertinent for our discussion today, um, our work originated in the early 2000s when we had a research grant from the National Institutes of Health. We had noticed that experiments in laboratories involving all different kinds of animals, rats, dogs, pigeons, humans, it didn't matter. This matching phenomenon seemed to occur. So John Barrero and I hypothesized that this might be what is going on with problem behavior in the natural environment. So we observed children interacting with their parents, their teachers, other care providers, and because we had a functional analysis conducted, we knew what reinforcers were maintaining the problem behavior. And then we retrospectively went back in time to look at when those reinforcers occurred in relation to problem behavior and in relation to appropriate behavior. What we found was that most of the reinforcement was occurring following problem behavior. So high levels of reinforcement were being delivered following problem behavior. And therefore, more problem behavior was occurring than appropriate behavior. And that is why you see the data points allocated up in this quadrant here. These are 4 different children, and this dashed line represents perfect matching. So if these data points fell right on the line, which they almost do, these children would be displaying perfect matching between the occurrence of problem behavior and reinforcement for problem behavior and the occurrence of appropriate behavior and reinforcement for appropriate behavior. Unfortunately, during a baseline situation, this is what we tend to see. More reinforcement is available for problem behavior. We're currently working on a manuscript for a study that we very recently completed. Ferris Cronfley was the uh, lead investigator on this study. Ferris is a former graduate student of mine at the University of Florida. He's now at Rutgers University. He developed this quadrant referent, which is based on work by many other individuals. But for the purposes of our discussion, I'd like you to focus on first quadrant 1. This is typically what we see before any intervention has occurred. The child emits proportionally more problem behavior relative to appropriate behavior, and the caregiver reinforces proportionally more problem behavior relative to appropriate behavior. And that's exactly what we saw, if you recall, in the Barrero and Vollmer study. So the aim of a behavioral intervention then should be to move behavior and response allocation down into quadrant 3, which is where the child emits proportionally more appropriate behavior relative to problem behavior, and the caregivers reinforce proportionally more appropriate behavior relative to problem behavior. So ideally, if extinction were in place, there would be no reinforcement of problem behavior. But we already know, based on our discussion earlier in this presentation, that that is very rare. Everybody makes mistakes. Problem behavior gets reinforced for various reasons. So our goal, our target should be to have proportionally more appropriate behavior reinforced. So in Ferris-Cronfli's study, we first replicated what we had found in the Barrero and Vollmer study, and that is that in baseline observations for 4 children, the majority of their problem behavior was, or the majority of their behavior was allocated toward problem behavior, and the majority of reinforcement was allocated toward that problem behavior. I'm not going to get into the math for this presentation today, um, other than to say that if you attend to that quadrant system that I just presented, this would be quadrant 1. This is where we expect behavior to be before any intervention. Next, we did an abbreviated version of the behavioral skills training, where the goal of that training was essentially to teach parents healthy contingencies, minimize reinforcement for problem behavior, maximize reinforcement for appropriate behavior. Then we conducted follow-up observations after the behavioral skills training, which closely matched the behavioral skills training that I discussed in the earlier part of this presentation, where we follow a sequence of modeling and feedback and follow-up for the parents. What we found was that in every case, problem behavior rates and allocations kind of slid down this diagonal and moved down into what we had called quadrant 3, or at least in the direction of quadrant 3, where now proportionally more appropriate behavior is being reinforced, and uh, therefore proportionally more appropriate behavior occurs. So this is an outcome of differential reinforcement that we would base on the matching law, and it's consistent with the use of the matching law. Now, I would be remiss if I did not point out that there are, in fact, other variables influencing response allocation. So that study by Ferris-Cronfli and the one earlier by Barrero and Vollmer, where we showed matching, we were basing that information strictly on response rate and rate of reinforcement. But a careful analysis of the matching literature shows us that there's much more going on to influence response allocation. Quality of reinforcement is one difference. So a lot of times in baseline, we'll see very low quality reinforcers, like low quality attention being delivered, like good job or something like that. Whereas very high quality attention that might involve physical contact and extended discussion can occur when serious problem behavior occurs. And so again, this tends to skew allocation toward problem behavior. And our task then is to try to enhance the quality of reinforcement for appropriate behavior and decrease the quality of reinforcement for problem behavior. I went over this in great detail in an earlier presentation in this conference, but I did want to review these dimensions here because they fit in with our new definition of differential reinforcement. It can still be differential reinforcement if the relative quality of reinforcement is differentially favoring appropriate behavior. Similarly, the magnitude or duration of reinforcement is often skewed toward problem behavior before any intervention is developed. So, in other words, a longer interaction or a longer period of escape or a longer period of access to tangible reinforcers commonly occurs when problem behavior occurs. When we develop a treatment, we should pay attention to making sure that the magnitude or duration of reinforcement favors the occurrence of appropriate behavior. The delay to reinforcement often favors problem behavior. So a parent or care provider will often immediately attend to problem behavior, but they may say, wait a minute, or I'll be there shortly when appropriate alternative behavior occurs. So again, in treatment, we want to shift that type of allocation. The response effort might favor problem behavior. So, for example, it might be very easy to reach out and hit someone in the face, but it might be very difficult to flip through a picture card system and identify the correct card. So, our task then in treatment needs to be to make it easier to get to the card and more effortful to make the aggressive response. And then finally, sometimes certain outcomes are actually punished. So somebody might raise their hand in a classroom, and the teacher might snap, "Not now. I'm not calling on you right now." And then the child engages in some problem behavior, and that produces attention from the teacher. That's just a hypothetical example, but it's one I think we've all seen something similar to that happen. So the point of going through this discussion of the matching law and then these other factors that influence response allocation is to show that even when the problem behavior continues to be reinforced, we can use the technique of differential reinforcement of alternative behavior to create systems that outweigh the reinforcement for the problem behavior. Is it challenging? Yes, of course it is. That's why I consider this to be an impediment. The use of or when a treatment cannot have an extinction component, that is an impediment. But we still have conceptual tools, if you will, to combat that. Another way that we have been Oh, I just wanted to show one graph from a study that we did several years back where we actually did what I just said, and that is we loaded the reinforcement on for appropriate manding in a classroom context. So the child was engaging in disruptive behavior in baseline, and during treatment, we stacked the deck with longer duration reinforcement, a longer or higher quality reinforcement, and a shorter delay to reinforcement for the mand, while still providing the reinforcement for the problem behavior. But the mand started to win out. Then we reversed back to baseline contingencies, then back to stacking the deck in favor of the mand, and eventually had the teacher take over. So that study was published by Athens and Vollmer in 2010. With two of the participants in that study, we did this approach of stacking the deck along multiple dimensions of reinforcement to get that solid treatment effect using differential reinforcement. I want to add that another treatment procedure that has been emerging over the past couple of decades um, is to use positive reinforcement, either contingent upon compliance or some alternative response um, as treatment for escape behavior. So this is somewhat counterintuitive because normally we think about treatments for escape behavior to involve something like a man requesting a break or something like that. But one problem with that is that it assumes that we want to keep the instructional context aversive. And of course, we don't. We want our clients to come to us during instructional activity. So, therefore, the use of positive reinforcement has several advantages, whether it's non contingent and just provided in the general area or made contingent on some alternative response. One advantage, as it turns out, some recent research has shown, is that using positive reinforcement for escape behavior reduces the motivating operation for escape behavior. And the reason we know this is because several studies have presented the positive reinforcers non-contingently. So it's not a schedule competition, it's simply reducing the aversiveness. I like to think of this similar to how we might do something like listen to music while we're running on the treadmill. While we're doing something like that, um, presumably we're presenting ourselves with preferred stimulation that sort of takes the edge off of something that might otherwise be aversive stimulation. Similarly, for our clients, if we have something like their favorite music playing in the background, maybe a video if it's not interfering with the learning experience, maybe even just giving them non contingent snacks during the work time, that has the tendency to decrease the motivation for escape behavior. There's also a phenomenon known as location matching. It's very similar conceptually. It's essentially the same thing as the matching law, except for rather than looking at discrete occurrences of responses, location matching research focuses on where someone locates themselves in space. And what has been shown repeatedly is that organisms will locate themselves where the richer source of reinforcement is. So if we consistently make reinforcement rich, relatively rich in the workspace, it makes it more likely that our clients will allocate their time into that location of the environment. And when we use positive reinforcement for of alternative behavior, such as for compliance, it sets up a schedule competition between appropriate and problem behavior. So it may be the case that uh, individuals are um, uh, uh, sometimes engaging in problem behavior to produce escape, but it might be more appealing to engage in the appropriate alternative behavior and produce positive reinforcement. Sometimes parents or teachers or other care providers are uncomfortable with using positive reinforcement, like having a video playing in the background or music playing or giving a child snacks um, as treatment for escape maintain behavior. They sort of view it as artificial or something that might otherwise impede their learning. It's something to keep in mind as a possible emergency treatment when behavior must be eliminated right away. So it's not necessarily an endpoint. Maybe you could work towards using tokens instead of food reinforcers, or maybe you could gradually fade out the use of music and so on. But with a lot of the severe behavior that we deal with and that I'm sure you have encountered, sometimes we need an immediate emergency treatment, and we have found that the use of positive reinforcement as treatment for escape behavior has been very effective in that manner. Here are a couple of examples from a study by Sarah Slocum published in 2015. In these figures, during baseline, the problem behavior, which was severe aggression for Brandon or for Braden, and screaming and yelling for Allie. It occurred very reliably in baseline at high levels. And then during treatment, we compared two treatments. In one treatment, the participants earned positive reinforcement for compliance. So they got highly preferred reinforcers delivered to them. Um, in the negative reinforcement treatment, they received a break contingent on compliance, which is a fairly commonly used intervention. What we found was that the positive reinforcement in virtually all of the participants, and clearly for these two participants, suppressed the problem behavior much better than did the negative reinforcement treatment condition. We reversed back to baseline and found that that was also true once we returned to baseline. So the lowest rates of the problem behavior occurred in this positive reinforcement condition in comparison to the negative reinforcement condition. We also looked at their levels of compliance and found that although Braden was not highly compliant, he was ultimately more compliant during the positive reinforcement condition in comparison to the negative reinforcement condition. And Allie was virtually 100% compliant in the positive reinforcement condition, but virtually never complied in the negative reinforcement condition. So we have gone on to do a number of applications using this general approach. I am not going to go into all of them today. I've presented them in other contexts, including here. But I did want to point out that this is an approach that we are using. One clinical case that I think really highlights this approach is one that I will talk about very briefly. It was a clinical case by Megan Deshay, and then my current graduate student, Lindsay Loveras, is developing systems for extending this into experimentation. But the general approach is that when our functional analysis shows us that behavior is maintained by escape, and we have determined that escape extinction is not feasible for any one of the aforementioned reasons. Maybe the client's too big, too fast, too slippery, whatever it might be. In phase one, we set up a concurrent choice where aggression produces escape to a barren area. A functional communication response, such as I need a break, produces escape to what we call the cool area. So there might be a beanbag chair with some fairly preferred items in that area. But if problem or excuse me, if the individual engages in the work or they display compliance, it produces highly preferred reinforcers at the workstation. So there's really kind of three choices. You can aggress and go sit somewhere where there's nothing to do. You can ask for a break and you can go to a pretty cool area to take a break, or you can work and receive the most highly preferred reinforcers. In a second phase, we start to require more work before the functional communication response is honored. So you have to do some work. You still get those positive reinforcers, the highly preferred reinforcers, but after a period of time, you can request and go to the escape to the cool area. So what we have found so far is that all of the participants who've been going through this are choosing to work. So they like to stay at the workstation where their highly preferred items are. They're engaging in very little problem behavior, despite the fact that extinction is not in place. They could be aggressive and go to the barren escape environment. And we have also found that when they do request a break, they've eventually, after a short period of time, been requesting to come back to work. So we've flipped around the the script, essentially. What used to be escape behavior, now they're asking to come to work under this contingency arrangement. I'll just quickly go through this one clinical example by Megan Deshay. During the baseline, the individual, who was a fairly large, but maybe 10, 11-year-old child, engaged in pretty severe aggression that was very difficult to place on extinction. So in baseline, he was given a brief escape period. Once we started that treatment that I just described, his aggression went down to almost zero. There's some other interesting facets of this application. What we also measured was the percentage of the session during which he was in either the workstation or taking the fun break or the cool break, and those were signified by the open circles. And we also measured the percentage of the session he was in the break or timeout period following the occurrence of aggressive behavior. And you can see that almost all of his time was spent either working or in the appropriate, fun, cool break area. So you might be thinking, well, maybe he wasn't working at all, but just hanging out in this cool area. That wasn't the case. We gradually increased the work requirements until or before he could request his break to the cool area. And eventually he just stopped asking for a break to the cool area. This figure shows the percentage of sessions spent at the work table. And toward the end of the intervention, he was working 100% of the session, not even asking to go to the break area. So this is a very pronounced effect. It led us to start doing more experimentation. Frankly, a problem that we're having is when we reserve the most highly preferred reinforcer for the workstation, we're getting kids who never even come in contact with the other contingencies because they continue to work, as we had seen in the Slocum and Vollmer 2015 study. So, in terms of some summary notes related to extinction as an impediment, of course, we would want to use extinction when we can because we want to eliminate reinforcement. However, we've identified some circumstances in which extinction is not viable. So, behavior analysts should be exploring interventions that do not require extinction, and several strategies already exist, namely use of differential reinforcement of alternative behavior while weighting reinforcement for appropriate behavior. And secondly, as treatment for escape behavior, using positive reinforcement based procedures is clearly very effective and has worked in the face of not being able to implement the extinction component. So, um, next, I would like to talk about some of the difficulties with prevention science that I discussed earlier as it relates to applied behavior analysis interventions. So, presently, we are developing what we believe to be an ethically sound model to evaluate problem behavior, stereotypic behavior, compliance, and communication across time. The study is currently in progress, although, of course, placed on hold recently due to the COVID shutdown, especially in Florida. We're not able to directly assess children presently. And my purpose today is not to get into details of this study. This would require an entire morning of presentation in its own right. But I want to kind of get at the notion of how we are presently trying to address this problem related to prevention science and the methods of applied behavior analysis. So, one of the problems that I mentioned related to prevention science is that we would want to see the emergence of problem behavior and sort of the path that problem behavior is taking. But that would require repeated functional analyses across time. And there are some potential ethical concerns or considerations related to doing functional analyses repeatedly over time. One is that a functional analysis provides if and only if contingencies. So, in other words, if you're setting up a functional analysis, you might set up a situation where the only way that the client receives attention is by engaging in the problem behavior. But that might be a concern because maybe earlier the problem behavior had already been treated, and maybe now the client knew to tap you on the shoulder or to say, hey, come talk to me, or something like that. But if you set up that functional analysis contingency again, maybe 6 or 8 weeks later, the problem behavior might reemerge because there's no other way to get the reinforcer. So that's an ethical problem. Also, the functional analysis provides reinforcement for the problem behavior. Normally, we justify this in our functional analysis approach because we have to get at what is maintaining the problem behavior, just as an allergist has to identify what allergens we react to, so they expose us to the allergens. Um, but to do it frequently and across time, it might exacerbate problem in a manner similar to intermittent reinforcement. So if we're testing people, let's say every month or every 6 to 8 weeks, we might be occasionally reinforcing the problem behavior such that it becomes stronger. So that's an ethical problem. And also, every time that we uh, deliver the functional analysis, we're taking someone away from their therapeutic environment or their educational environment. So, what we're trying to do is get around some of these ethical problems by doing the functional analysis a little bit differently than normal. One of our aims is to evaluate the possible emergence of stereotypic behavior during no interaction conditions. So we're not providing any social reinforcement for problem behavior. We're just seeing if it emerges when we're watching children briefly when they're not receiving social interaction. We're also interested in evaluating the emergence of rigid play behavior because we've noticed that somewhere along the line, children develop behavior such as lining blocks up in a particular manner or lining cars up according to color. And then if that gets disrupted, they may have problem behavior. But where does that emerge? We want to watch them when they're playing alone and playing with adults, but with no social contingencies on that behavior, just to see how that and when that kind of emerges in an individual case. And then we also do want to evaluate the function of problem behavior, but the way that we're addressing the ethical dilemmas is that we are also reinforcing appropriate behavior during these functional analyses. So we are allowing the children to gain access to the reinforcer through some appropriate behavior. And that way, if we see appropriate behavior emerging, we would not be reinforcing the problem behavior. We also are using a trial based approach so that rather than pulling children away for extended periods of time, we're actually able to embed a motivating operation into their everyday environment. So, for example, we might walk up and present an instructional demand, or we might walk up and ask their therapist, turn away for 30 seconds and let's see what happens. And then if the child asks for attention or engages in problem behavior, the individual would turn back around. So it's embedded into their day-to-day environment. Um, I mentioned on here that we have done some twin comparisons just by coincidence. As we were developing this approach, we had two pairs of twins that both went through. And it's kind of a spoiler alert, but I'm going to tell you that it's been remarkable to see how similar the twins' outcomes were over time as we assessed their behavior at 6 to 8 week intervals. So this figure shows one of the units of our assessment. So unit one would have been at point zero in time, and then 6 to 8 weeks later, we would have done unit two, and then 6 to 8 weeks after that, we would have done unit three. I just brought this along to show you the similarity that we're seeing with some of the twins. Now, remember, these are trial-based approaches. So we've actually conducted 10 trials, but our study has shown us that 5 trials shows exactly the same outcome as 10, so we can really abbreviate that, and again it addresses that ethical component. But that's another study that has emerged out of this, is to show that 5 trial-based assessments are just as effective as 10 trial-based, cutting it in half. um, but here, what we have is the latency to the appropriate behavior at the top, and notice it goes from 0 to 60 seconds. So 60 seconds is down here. That's because a longer latency represents a lower um, projected rate of behavior. Um, and then we have in the center panel the latency to problem behavior. And then in the third panel, it's the latency to problem behavior or appropriate behavior. So we're just essentially looking for a sensitivity to these different contingencies. In this case, neither twin showed a sensitivity to attention as reinforcement. Um, Both of them had one instance of appropriate behavior related to attention, getting someone's attention in the 5th trial. And incidentally, these twins were not conducted together. These were separate assessments, but remarkable how their outcomes looked the same in that respect, and also with respect to tangible items. They both showed extremely short latencies to engage in appropriate behavior that produced access to tangibles, but no problem behavior as it related to tangibles. I will say in earlier units, they did display some problem behavior in relation to tangibles, but they had, in the 6 to 8, then 6 to 8 week interval, learned appropriate alternative behavior, and that was picked up in the context of the assessment. Similarly, they showed very little problem behavior as depicted in the center panel in relation to escape from instructional demands, but their latency to either asking for a break or displaying compliance was very short. So the assessment outcomes with respect to demand were also very similar for these twins. So, to summarize the findings to date on the longitudinal project, we have been able to detect sensitivity to various sources of reinforcement at these 6 to 8 week intervals. Um, in both cases of the twins that we have, they're showing remarkably similar outcomes over time. We're actually writing that sub component of the study up for publication right now. We're working on that this summer. Um, and I didn't show the data on this today, but we have seen the emergence of both stereotypic behavior and rigid play in some of those alone or play sessions where we're just observing. Some side notes. We have been able to evaluate modifications of the trial based approach. I'll go into details about that some other time, but one note is 5 trials seems to be an adequate test to detect the function of behavior. Another side note is that probably all you have to look at is the behavior when the establishing operation is in place, such as instructions being presented, and then when prior to that, when there is no instructions in place, and compare the latencies to problem behavior in those different contexts. So next, I want to talk about some work toward solutions related to the problem of behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement. There's a typical treatment progression that has kind of emerged in the literature, and it's one that my lab has really followed now for over 25 years. We typically start by examining environmental enrichment. And the reason for this is, as Hagopian has shown recently, and I mentioned this earlier, there is some problem behavior that is automatically reinforced that his group has labeled subtype 1. And this subtype of automatically reinforced behavior tends to decrease and possibly even go away when highly preferred alternative environments are made, or excuse me, alternative stimuli are available in the environment, and we refer to that as environmental enrichment. However, sometimes the behavior does not entirely go away, and it requires some kind of differential reinforcement contingency, maybe to teach someone an alternative play skill or teach them some alternative response to the dangerous behavior. Then, when we start to get into subtype 2, or the behavior that persists even in the face of environmental enrichment, very frequently in the literature we see that some kind of blocking is required, maybe a brief hands down timeout or movement restriction type of timeout, or some kind of mild punishment procedure. This is one reason why automatically reinforced behavior is an impediment to effective treatment, because unlike in the socially reinforced behavior where we rarely have to use punishment procedures, you do see punishment procedures introduced more frequently in the literature, such as in RIRD type interventions. In some extreme cases where individuals have been hospitalized, there might be more extreme punishment or restraint put in place next. One thing that I like to point out, and I really highlighted this in my talk last year, if any of you were there, is that we focus on overall skill development and early intervention. It's always in the backdrop. We never just do environmental enrichment or just do differential reinforcement, because we have to ensure that the individuals are gaining other skills that can replace automatically reinforced problem behavior. So we focus on potty training, communication skills, all of the early intervention types of skills that one can think of. I mentioned that we've been doing this general progression for many, many years. This is some results from an early study that we did where Ron engaged in self-injurious ear picking. And in the EE plus condition, that was environmental enrichment with preferred stimuli, you can see that he started to engage in appropriate interaction with the preferred stimuli, and the self-injurious behavior went down to very low levels. In the EE minus condition, we presented him with toys, but they were not necessarily highly preferred toys. And that showed the importance of having highly preferred stimuli in the environment. So we've been working very hard to identify preferred stimuli for individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism. And a focus of our recent research has been to find uh, preferred items that are not necessarily edible. We think that it's probably unhealthy for individuals to be receiving lots and lots of edible items. So Danny Conine in this first study, which has already been published, and Crystal Slanzi replicated that study in Italy, has shown that children do have leisure stimuli that will at times compete with edible stimuli. Sam Morris has done a whole string of research. I think he has 5 papers published over the last 2 years, um, evaluating social interaction as reinforcement, which is really interesting given the diagnostic features of autism. But he's consistently finding that either children do prefer some form of social interaction, or if they tend to be socially avoidant, by using other reinforcement contingencies, we can start to get them to allocate behavior towards social interaction. And then another reference I put here for you is one, again, by Ferris Cronfley, who is looking for edibles that might be healthier. So the evaluating the efficacy of fruits and vegetables compared to sweet and salties like chips and candies, which one typically sees in EIBI types of settings. So I wouldn't have time to go through all of these studies, but they're all available either through Early View, which you can see at Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis online, and some of them, a couple of them have already come out in print, such as the Conine and the Cronfley study. So I mentioned that at times the environmental enrichment approach does not necessarily work in and of itself. So we have to add differential reinforcement, as we did here for Corey, who was, I believe, a 4-year-old boy, where we had to actually reinforce toy play through praise and small treats of food. And once we taught him to interact with the toys, he then showed a suppression in his self-injurious behavior. Later on, that started to wear off a little bit in the second EE plus and positive reinforcement condition. So we conducted a new preference assessment, and when we identified his newer preferences, then we were able to replicate that finding. In a more recent study published by Sarah Slocum in Behavioral Interventions, we examined differential reinforcement um, as a treatment for pica. So we were working with a young girl, I think she was about 12 years old at the time, maybe 13. Um, she displayed pica in the form of eating sand off of carpeted floor. One problem of living in the state of Florida is that really all of our state used to be underwater, and so there's a lot of sand in the soil, and this ends up getting into carpets and so on. So she had developed the behavior of gathering that sand and eating it. In the DRA condition, we essentially reinforced discarding the sand into the trash can, in which case she would receive a preferred edible um, item. So this was a case where we had to arrange a contingency to reinforce the alternative behavior. Back to that earlier study, and again, I have talked about Rhonda at this conference before. She's interesting because, well, for a lot of reasons, she's interesting, but she was also diagnosed with Rett syndrome. So she had a lot of hand mouthing and hand wringing type of behavior. And she was one for whom we eventually just had to implement a hands down timeout contingency for in order to see the full effects of the intervention. And we eventually taught this to her mother and to her 12-year-old sister to implement for at least portions of the day. Obviously, you can't do a hands down timeout throughout the day, but if we could reduce it during 10 and 15-minute play periods and do that several times per day, that would decrease the overall occurrence of behavior greatly. But this is a case where simply environmental enrichment and differential reinforcement would not have effectively suppressed the behavior. So I mentioned that we are focusing on targeting a lot of alternative skills as sort of the backdrop, because research has shown that the more skills that an individual has in their repertoire, the less likely they are to engage in automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior and severe stereotypy. So we have focused recently on communication training, toilet training, um, developing generalized imitative repertoires. I said matching repertoires. I don't know why I put that, but imitative repertoires, responding to name, which is a deficit that has been shown to occur in individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism, and just generally increasing social interaction skills. So, again, in the interest of time, I'll give you some references. These are not the focus of my talk, but I thought I would be remiss if I did not mention that this is truly at the heart of our interventions and prevention strategies for the development and emergence of automatically reinforced behavior. We have found, and others have shown, that by increasing the relative skill repertoire, we see decreases in the sensitivity to the emergence of automatically reinforced behavior. So, some examples here, including the use of textual prompts for generalized instruction following, Sam Morris again for assessing preferences for social interactions, Danny Conine's work on response to name in children with autism, uh, tr- developing treatments, evaluating generalization of that and maintenance, and then Megan Deshay's work on fixed and repetitive models during imitation training. I didn't mention here that we have some work coming out on uh, potty training. Brandon Perez is the author. That should be coming out in early view fairly soon. We're finding that procedures that are used typically for uh, typically developing children in preschools are also effective for a lot of children with autism. So that's a really good skill for people to have that may function as a replacement for various forms of problem behavior. I'm happy to send anyone copies of these articles if you reach out to me via email. This might be a good time to give my email address. My email address is Vollmer, my last name, then the letter A at UFL, as in University of Florida, .edu. And I'm happy to send you copies of any of these articles if you're interested. So we talked in the early part a lot about behavior that requires medical evaluation. And to be perfectly honest, our research in this realm is less advanced than some of the other areas that I've just been describing. But we are starting to do some work developing models for this type of evaluation. So, our general model in terms of evaluating antecedent influences by medical or physiological variables um, is that we first want to directly measure that medical or physiological variable. Um, Secondly, we want to evaluate whether there is, in fact, a correlation with that variable and the occurrence of problem behaviors. Because a lot of times that is fairly speculative. People will say, like, oh, he was sick today, so he probably, or that's probably why he had a lot of problem behavior, or he had allergies today, or she didn't sleep well last night. Next, we want to conduct functional analyses in the presence and absence of such variables to see if they actually do exacerbate the behavior. And then a final stage, which we have not even started to reach yet, is to treat um, these these interactions through either schedule modifications or other intervention components when variables are identified. So, for example, if we find out that someone had a poor night of sleep, we might then arrange their schedule differently, or we might develop sleep uh, oriented interventions to try to improve sleep, such as rearranging their schedule in the evening to promote better sleep habits and so on. There was an interesting study published over 20 years ago by Craig Kennedy and Kim Meyer, where they did something very similar to this methodology that I just described. They did one series of functional analysis a day, of functional analysis conditions per day, 3 to 5 days per week. They took descriptive data on whether or not the individual was sleep deprived or had some allergy symptoms. Um, the unfortunate thing was the sleep deprivation was based solely on parent report, and we don't know how accurate that was. But they did find that there were increases in escape maintained problem behavior across all three participants on the establishing operation days. So, in other words, when sleep deprivation was in place, there was more escape behavior. When allergy symptoms were in place, there was more escape behavior. And that makes sense from a standpoint of essentially not feeling well. Well, what we're doing related to sleep is that we are still asking parents to report sleep, but now there are many methods available to get a more direct measurement of sleep. So, use of Fitbits, for example. We have sleep pads that can go underneath the mattress and measure reasonably well someone's sleep activity. Um, and then we're getting direct measurement of problem behavior each day of the week in the clinic setting or home setting. We're trying to adapt it actually now due to the COVID restrictions. But some kids, we were able to do this when they were attending the clinic, and some kids are starting to slowly come back to the clinics. But the eventual directions is that we, as I said, we want to develop sleep interventions. So how can we promote better sleep? Or or I should say, schedule modifications based on whether or not they slept well the night before. One of our clinical cases of this came from some colleagues from another state who showed us that on nights when there was disrupted sleep for their particular client, there was a much higher proportion of days with problem behavior. So this individual displayed relatively low rates of problem behavior, but it was much more likely to occur on a day when they had a poor night of sleep than when they had undisrupted sleep the night before. So, this is kind of an example of the sort of data analysis that one could do to start to figure out whether or not sleep is actually correlated with problem behavior or lack of sleep. We're looking at this a little bit more closely right now, and this is work being done by Lindsay Loveros, who I've already mentioned as one of my um, current doctoral students, and she's a board certified behavior analyst. Uh, in this particular study, she's examining the problem behavior of uh, several children eventually, but in this example, I'll show one child who displayed several different forms of problem behavior, one of which was elopement or running out of the therapy area. Um, what Lindsay found is that there was a negative correlation between elopement and the total hours of sleep. So, in other words, the more the child slept, the less likely she was to display elopement. Now, of course, this is a correlation, but it's an interesting beginning of the finding to see if, in fact, that this correlation exists. We have not yet correlated the parent report to the direct measurement of sleep. This figure shows the occurrence of elopement against the hours awake during the night, so kind of the inverse of what I just showed you. And now we see a positive correlation where the more hours she was awake during the night, the more likely she was to display elopement at the clinic the next day. This figure shows a positive correlation for flopping. So the greater number of night wakenings she had, the more likely she was to display flopping. So that's just a snapshot of some early work that we're doing in that realm related to medical and physiological variables. But hopefully, you can see how that could be translated to allergy symptoms or um, maybe when someone is in some kind of physical pain, evaluating the behavior in the presence or absence of those other kinds of variables. I want to briefly go into this problem that I mentioned earlier about some forms of behavior like aggression and biting that seem to occur for reasons that have not been well examined, at least in applied behavior analysis. I mentioned the chapter by Hudson, which was published in 1977. So this research really should have influenced applied behavior analysis, but has not for decades. What Hutchinson showed was that organisms bite in the presence of aversive stimulation. So this shows a monkey when shock occurs, biting occurs, and the monkey will bite a bar, it will bite itself, it will bite essentially whatever is available to bite. Monkeys will even work to get something to bite when they're receiving aversive stimulation. Um, Humans also bite in the presence of aversive stimulation. So this was a jaw clenching response that the human displayed in the presence of aversive noise. Now, this jumps out at me because of the situation I described earlier where something like a dump truck goes by or a school alarm, a fire alarm goes off, and the child starts biting their hand. We've typically thought of that as escape behavior in some way, but perhaps it is automatically reinforced. It might be even elicited in some way by the aversive stimulus. So, in short, we should be taking into account these aversive stimuli as antecedents controlling the behavior, at least possibly in some cases. So this figure on the left shows the time since termination of food reinforcement. So as opposed to the presentation of aversive stimulation, these animals displayed attack as soon as their reinforcers were removed. So this sounds very similar to when we take that iPad away. Um, in circumstances when no reinforcement was ever available, we see very low levels of attack duration. But when they're receiving those reinforcers and then we place that on extinction, high levels of attack, even though the attack is never reinforced by representation of the positive reinforcement. So, my purpose here is to suggest that what we have typically considered to be escape maintained behavior or behavior maintained by tangibles could just as well be influenced by the presentation of aversive stimulation or the removal of positive reinforcers. We have a confound set up in our uh, functional analysis conditions, so we have to be careful of that. An interesting example from the applied literature was um, can be found in a widely cited and influential study by Brian Iwata and colleagues published in 1990. In this study, they had several participants who they showed displayed self-injurious behavior in an instructional demand condition. So the behavior was stated to be escape maintained behavior. Now, for most of the subjects in the study, in fact, all but one of the subjects, they were able to use escape extinction. And when they placed the behavior on extinction by physically guiding the person through the response, they saw reductions in the self injurious behavior. However, one subject, Lana, displayed self injurious biting. So keep in mind, the biting response was what I was describing in the presence of aversive stimulation. So in this study, during baseline, she received escape contingent on the biting. In the second condition, the biting was placed on extinction. In other words, she was never allowed to escape. Well, the question is, why did this behavior persist even though no escape contingency was in effect? Well, based on the work by Hutchinson and what I'm suggesting we should explore more in applied behavior analysis, it's very possible that the behavior was more highly controlled by the antecedent aversive event of receiving the instruction. It wasn't until they provided contingent physical guidance and response blocking that the behavior actually went away. So it wasn't sensitive to extinction alone, which suggests the reinforcer, which was presumed to be escape, may not have actually been identified. Perhaps it was automatically reinforcing in the context of aversive stimulation, or in some way the aversive stimulation elicited the biting. It's clearly something we need to explore more. I know that any of you working in this field with children with disabilities or autism or adults, you've seen this happen where some aversive event happens, they bite, and it may not be related to escape or getting access again to a tangible item. So, to summarize some of the thoughts on biting, I think it will be important in the future for us to conduct functional analyses with and without the escape or tangible contingency while maintaining the antecedent. So, in other words, if we still present the demand with no escape contingency and the behavior persists, it tells us it's probably more controlled by the antecedent. Similarly, if we remove toys but never give the toy back contingent on problem behavior, and the behavior persists every time we remove the toy, it suggests it's more controlled by the antecedent, especially these biting responses and possibly aggressive responses, as has been shown in the basic literature summarized by Hutchinson. So, what this might do in terms of treatment could be very different than what we have typically done with escape extinction based treatments or differential reinforcement based treatments with for tangible functions. For example, if biting something itself becomes reinforcing in the presence of alternative stimulation, the task might be to identify the most preferred alternative item to bite. So I know people use chewy toys and different things like that, but we don't spend a lot of time figuring out what the person would actually prefer to bite rather than bite their hand in the presence of these types of aversive events. Maybe if we could provide positive reinforcers, we could offset some of the aversiveness, like we talked about in terms of using positive reinforcement as treatment for escape behavior. Maybe that sound of the school alarm would be less aversive if something favorable was happening, like you're having your favorite snack. Or maybe we could implement stimulus attenuating mechanisms. Some recent research has come out, I think from Wayne Fisher's group, showing the use of noise canceling headphones, which might be another treatment mechanism if we know that the biting is caused primarily by the antecedent as opposed to by the socially mediated consequences it produces. So, in short, what I'm saying is that recognition that the antecedent events might control behavior could lead us down a different path of treatment. And it's one that we as a field should be exploring systematically. The final area that I will talk about in terms of some proposed solutions relates to this notion of service disruption that many of us have experienced recently and that we will likely experience during holiday breaks, you know, uh, snow closings, hurricane closings, other things that happen where suddenly parents are or other care providers are expected, if you will, to be the therapist. And I mentioned that um, there are those themes to consider that parents and families struggle with this. They're juggling a whole bunch of different obligations. And so we cannot really expect that they can become the RBT or the applied behavior analyst. But on the other hand, we're struggling because our ethical guidelines demand that we continue to provide service that will be meaningful for that family. So we should just be recommending fluff activities without an eye for what is evidence-based. Um, but I think that I can argue effectively that we can keep it simple. We can keep it fun, but we can keep it sound. We could make sure that we're recommending procedures that are evidence-based. So I'll just summarize by saying there are 5 points to consider. One is environmental enrichment is one of the most evidence-based procedures in all of behavior analysis. In short, it is okay for a behavior analyst to recommend and for a parent to implement environmental enrichment or variations thereof at different points throughout the day. So parents need break time. They need time to get away. It's okay for them to put out a wide range of potentially preferred items and allow their child to play for a period of time. The play contacts automatic reinforcement for alternative behavior, that is the play, and dozens of studies. And in fact, a recent review paper has shown that environmental enrichment suppresses problem behavior. So this is an evidence-based and relatively easy approach. If a behavior analyst is viewing remotely, they can do a preference assessment by examining which items the children interact with the most. We've already started doing this in our lab, fairly straightforward and simple to do, and it gives the parents at least a semblance of a break. Differential reinforcement, I've discussed this at length today, is the most evidence-based feature of applied behavior analysis. Um, but it's a lifestyle. It's something that can be done at all times. Sorry that my screen has chopped part of this off a little bit, but basically what I'm saying is that differential reinforcement isn't something that you have to do. You don't have to have gadgets. You don't have to have other items. It's just an interactional style. You load on reinforcement when appropriate behavior occurs. You minimize the reaction and reinforcement when problem behavior occurs. So this can happen when someone is on a walk. It can happen when you're playing. It can happen while you're preparing lunch. It doesn't have to be something you stop and do. It's not an add-on. It's just a way to flow through the day. So both of these actually can make life easier for a very busy parent, and they're both evidence-based. Third, we may want to continue to teach children self-care and daily living activities, but let's pick ones that families already have to do. So everybody always already has to get dressed. Everybody already has to make breakfast or lunch. So pick one of those and focus on that for skill acquisition until the child can become relatively independent. Help the parent and coach them through how to do that through task analyses, behavioral chaining, but we don't have to add it on to their schedule. Do it during the time when those events already happen. Fourth, as you'll see in our literature, more and more studies are focusing on physical activity as a target. Physical activity is really good for everyone involved. Exercise has very favorable health outcomes for the child and for other family members. A lot of times, parents will think of it as like, oh, I'm not really doing my job as a parent, or behavior analysts will think this isn't an appropriate target. Well, it is. It's a very, very healthy target, and it's fine for families to do things like take a walk, take a bike ride. It's easily measurable, and also you can conduct preference assessments for physical activity. Um, it's measurable in the sense that a parent could wear a Fitbit to see how roughly how many steps were taken, or they could measure how long the bike ride was if they have bikes or take bike rides. So physical activity is something to fill the schedule with as well. And then a final recommendation And again, this is just a not a finite list. There are many other recommendations, but these are five that kind of pop out at me in times such as this with service disruption. And that is that instructional activity can be fun. We can use positive reinforcement. We can embed instructional activity into preferred activities. We don't need to expect that parents will sit for hours across a table and deliver instructions and follow specific protocols for prompting. Rather, we can spend our time to teach them in teaching them how do you use positive reinforcement to make it more appealing to do instructional activity? How might you embed instructional activity into the child's most preferred activities? Maybe it's a favorite show or a favorite song. We can still work on tacts and mans and interverbals and um, identification and imitation during the context of these fun things. Um, and so just getting the maximum out of that when those are happening. So I could go on and on. In fact, I have in other presentations I've given recently talked about this for a full day, basically. But I just wanted to give you five quick points to consider to possibly get around some of the impediments associated with your own uh, your own need to follow your ethical principles, but also to be aware of the constraints that parents are under presently. So, um, to wrap up, the overall thesis of today's study is that the typical model for behavioral treatment is superb. There's no doubt about that. But let's face the fact that the literature is likely skewed to ignore known impediments to effective treatment. So when everything goes perfectly, behavioral treatments work really, really well, and there's no question about that. But lots of things can get in the way. Maybe we can't use extinction. Maybe there are medical variables. Maybe the behaviors automatically reinforce. Maybe the parents are juggling a whole bunch of things and treatment integrity is low. Maybe the biting isn't operant in the way that we typically think of it. Maybe something else is going on. So I've identified examples of ones that we already know to be impediments, or other ones that are possible impediments, like these biting situations. And I have attempted to describe some of our action towards solutions and maybe make some suggestions to you that you could implement in your own research or clinical work, depending on what you do towards solutions. But clearly, far more research and clinical application is needed. And that's what I view as the overarching purpose of this discussion, is to really get us all thinking about what are the implications of this for our clinical application? How could this discussion guide future research? And we've got a long ways to go, but overall, in the field of behavior analysis, we have the basis to move in that direction. Thank you all for your time. Take care.